Hey there, bibliophiles and those raising bibliophiles. If you have a reader who loves World War II, then I have a book that you should check out. So today's book review is by Gratz, and it's Heroes. And I'm going to be honest, the last time I did a book review of Gratz, I wasn't a fan. It was 2 degrees, and I just didn't care for it at all. There were just so many things that were wrong with that book. So if you haven't seen my review of that, you definitely should go and check it out before you decide if you want your reader to read it. There's just a lot of social agenda stuff in that one. But I was glad to see that Heroes really went back to the good old, true and faithful topics that Ellen Gratz has been known so great to cover. So Heroes is a Pearl Harbor attack. The country is attacked, obviously, from Pearl Harbor. He does talk about in his author's note how he did have to sort of change some of the timeline of events a little bit just to make it fit with the narrative. But like the sinking of the Arizona and the Utah, like all those different things, those did happen. And that he's sort of talking about that in the book. And so while some things would have happened simultaneously in real life, he did use his creative license in his historical fiction to sort of break the mold of that just a little bit, just so he can get everything in with the narration. So this particular story centers around, obviously, the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And in the scenes, just as a reminder, if you've read anything of his before, seen my other reviews, so he's not sugarcoating historical events. There are some scenes that may be considered too gruesome for readers. So, for example, at one point, the USS Arizona explodes, and there's details of like the raining body parts. It's not graphic, but just the idea, like in presenting the idea that like body parts were falling all around them, right? That might be a little much for some readers. They also are instances where the main characters are talking about, you see like dead bodies from other sailors in the water that they're trying to get through. When escaping a capsizing ship, the boys hear the sailors on the inside, they're tapping out SOS. And so they have to leave them. And so that decision is like really heart-wrenching. So that would be the one word of caution I would have for parents is really consider the sensitivity of your reader in regards to the details of war, because it's not pretty, but it is an intriguing story, and he does try and make it as real as possible without being overly graphic. The story centers around this particular one, two friends, Stanley Summers and Frank McCoy. Their fathers are both in the Navy, and they are stationed in Hawaii. Stanley's mother is of Japanese ancestry, which makes Stanley partially Japanese. And it's important to note that both Stanley and his mother are American citizens because they were born in the U.S. Stanley is Frank's first like real friend ever, so they've moved a lot. And what really ties these two together is their love of comics. And so that's kind of central to the story, is this idea of trying to come up with a comic hero, and Frank wants to be the writer and Stanley the illustrator. And so as they're going throughout the story, they're kind of relaying or thinking about some of that. The story opens up with the day before the attack. So a young boy is being bullied, and Stanley steps in to defend the young boy, but Frank doesn't. He just sort of watches it all take place, and then Stanley gets beat up by these boys. And so that kind of becomes a point of contention between them for the rest of that day. And then Frank is really dealing with the fact that he's ashamed and he's terrified to explain to Stanley why he suffers from extreme fear. So Frank's character is one in the story who's extremely fearful. Another key character in the book is Brooks, who's Frank's sister's boyfriend. Brooks takes Stanley and Frank on a tour of the USS Utah, and that's where they are in the morning when the attacks come. One of the greatest aspects of this book is that the reader can watch and learn from Frank's internal struggle with fear and his desire to overcome it, because to act as though we never have fear would be incorrect and it would be irrational. So for our readers to really see that, courage is when you're fearful and you act, despite all of that. And at no point in this book, just, even though Frank is dealing with the struggle of fear, like there's never a message that you just should not be afraid. the overall message is that you can still act even when you are feeling like you're encompassed by fear, but to be brave and to be courageous despite that. So the world is crashing down around them. These brave young characters become sort of the superheroes of their comics as they risk their lives to help save other sailors who have been harmed in the Japanese attacks. Many aspects of scripture could be tied to this story with the idea of fear, but also bravery and sacrificing yourself in order to assist others. So I think there's a lot there that you could explore with your reader. The book is set in 3 different stages. It's before, during, and after. In the after section, Gratz conveys the tragic act of prejudice that was projected onto those of Japanese ancestry and descent in America. And so that's not hidden from the book either. He really does talk about that. We see that with Stanley and his mother, who, while in Hawaii, aren't facing like the far-reaching effects that people on the mainland are. And so Stanley is participating in the varsity victory volunteers, and he's digging graves. Frank does confront him, letting him know that, like, you had no part to do in this, and like digging the graves is not going to atone for what the Japanese did. And Stanley's response to that is like, that's not what he's doing. He's burying heroes, and the fact that all of these people who died are heroes. So the book does end with Frank and his mother and sister being evacuated with the other families to California. Frank wants to make sure that Stanley and he remain friends, and so they kind of leave this text for a comic in the store. So the book ends with like the comic version of the story that they piece together. Overall, I really enjoyed this story. I think it offers a glimpse into the perspective that's not often told with World War II, and that's like the Japanese Americans and the response to them. So while that isn't like strong, like that's what the whole story is about, he doesn't hide from that, and he does bring it up. And so it leaves the reader to go and maybe research and learn more on their own. Again, he does make some changes a little bit to the timeline in the story, but if you love history, if you love an action-packed story, then I would definitely recommend Alan Gratz's newer novel, Heroes, to read.